Brigadier General Scott McKean, Deputy Commanding General at Fort Benning. And on behalf of Major General Miller and all the soldiers and family members, first off, I'd like to say thank you to Columbus and the River Valley community for all the support that you do give us each and every day. There is no doubt in your steadfast and resolute support for all of our soldiers and family members. And I can't think of a better person to be here from the Pentagon, if there's ever a good person from the Pentagon. Probably going to get cited there now. But someone who's no stranger to Fort Benning, who is a battalion commander here at Fort Benning, and has served most of his career coming back to Fort Benning for his schooling, Roger Cloutier.
Well, I am the guy from the Pentagon. Well, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Ledger-Enquirer, thank you so much for hosting us. We're here to hear your voice. We've got the data. We know how many ranges there are on Fort Benning. We've got the economic indicators. We know trends. We know how many square footage of buildings there are on the installation. What we need to bring back to the Pentagon and to the senior Army leadership is your story. We need to bring that context back. The Pentagon is a long way from Fort Benning in the Columbus area, and so that texture, that story, that's what we want to bring back to the senior leaders. I want to talk a little bit about timing. So sequestration is the law of the land, and as such, we have a mission to do, and that mission is potentially to draw the active component force down to the size of 420,000, 920,000 in the total Army. That's the active component, the National Guard, and the Army Reserve. So that would be a total reduction, if full sequestration is realized, of about 125,000 soldiers across all three components by fiscal year 19. Along with that, there would be corresponding reductions of about 26,000 Department of the Army civilians. As we go through this process, Colonel Conzelman will brief you on the details of what we're going to do, but I want to assure you that no decisions have been made. I brief General Odierno and the Secretary pretty regularly on where we are and the way ahead, and I can assure you that your voice matters. What you say here tonight will be carried back. The timing, we anticipate that the entire process will be done. We've done 17 listening sessions so far. We have 13 more to go. We're going to go to 30 different installations to do these. After that's done, along with some other Army processes, we'll bring that back to the senior leadership. And we anticipate that a decision will be made late spring, early summer, and probably an announcement sometime around then on what force structure reductions will occur.
How's that? Any better? No. How's that? Okay. Let's get out of my league. I have a couple slides I'm going to talk to you about, sort of show you what's going on. I work for General Cloutier. I am his Division Chief. And the first thing that we want to talk to you a little bit about is the purpose of today's session. So why are we here? Well, first, we want to talk to you a little bit about what the Army's process is. And I think most important in that is transparency. We owe you nothing less, and you should expect nothing less, than complete transparency from us on our whole process as we move through this. Now, as General Cloutier mentioned, all of what happens here today we will take back to the Pentagon and will be put in binders for the most senior leaders within the Department of the Army. All of that will be part of the entire process for them to make these very critical decisions. And they take them very seriously. This is not something that they or we take very lightly. We understand that every one of these decisions has an impact and a cascading effect that are touched on multiple levels. So as General Cloutier mentioned before, that's why we're here, to hear your story. And we're going to take that back so we can package all of it. I do have just a very simple agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about what the Army's done in the past, primarily what we did in 2013. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing. We'll talk a little bit more about the SPEA that some of you are so familiar with. We'll talk a little bit about what the Army senior leaders use to make their decisions. And then, of course, finally, we'll listen to what it is that you have to say so we can take your story. Now, what we've done, and I want to just focus on that first bullet. In 2013, General Odierno served in the Pentagon briefing room, and he announced what was the largest organizational structure to the United States Army since World War II. Within that, we went from 45 brigade combat teams down to 32. And you can see up there it says Brigade Combat Team Reorganization. Now that was critical, going from 45 to 32. It got to what the Secretary of Defense was talking about with his tooth-to-tail ratio. So we were able to decrease our overall headquarters, but we were actually able to almost expand our tip of our spear. And that would be the soldiers serving in those units. So the maneuver battalions that you've been hearing so much about, that 3rd Maneuver Battalion, which is part of the remaining 32 BCTs, is what was all part of that process. But it really was more than just the BCT reorganization. There were 740 units that were impacted by that decision that the Chief of Staff did on June 25th of 2013. That was 50.9% of the total active force. And that was over 2 fiscal years, fiscal year 14 and what we're doing right now, fiscal year 15. It was supposed to be out through 17, but we decided to accelerate that because we had concerns that we were going to have to go below 490. And so we wanted to get to 490 as fast as we could for that jumping off point. So going from 570 to 490, that was a 14% decrease in our wartime high of 570,000. So as we look at going below that, that's why we're here with you today. First, we had 22,000 soldiers in what we call TESI. That was our temporary end strength increase. Now that is unstationed structure. Those are men and women serving in uniform that allowed the units to deploy at above 100% if they had to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. In that sense, if somebody twisted their ankle or had to go on emergency leave, it did not decrease the overall effectiveness of the organization. Then we had something you can see up there called wartime allowance. That's another 10,000 soldiers. So that's really TESI by another name. So that's 32,000 soldiers right there before we had to touch any real units. Then we had another 11.3 thousand that we brought back from Europe. And then we have something called our TTHS, which is very familiar, I think, to Fort Benning. That's our transies, trainees, oldies, and students. And that holds at about 13% of our overall force. So we went from 570 down to 490. That decreased by about 7.3 thousand soldiers as well. So before we touched any unit, we were already able to find 50,000 spaces that we were able to take down to go from 570 to 490. Where it gets complicated is that as we go from 490 down to 450, or heaven forbid down to 420, we don't have that luxury anymore. At that point, we're just talking about units that are in existence today that are being soldiered by men and women in uniform. And that's part of the process that we're going through right now at the Pentagon. So, what is the Army doing and why? Well, of course, we do face very difficult budget constraints right now. And you can see that over the next 10 years, it looks like the Army's bill is going to be about $95 billion. So that is what's driving what General Cloutier mentioned before about the law of the land. That's where we are. And so as we look at going from 490 down to 450 or 420, there's only so many places where we can find the dollars. And that's either in manning, equipping, modernization, or training. Now what scares the Secretary and the Chief of Staff the most is sending our men and women into combat without the proper training that they need. So these are the questions that they're grappling with right now. And you can see 490 down to 450, that would be a 21% decrease of our wartime high of 570. Then if we have to go down to 420, that would be a 26% of our overall wartime high. And of course, for those of you who have been reading in the paper, That would be the lowest we've been since just prior to World War II, when we were at about 269,000 in 1940. Within all of that whole process is where are we going to get the numbers, and what units do we have to use to get there. So as General Cloutier mentioned, that's what the Secretary and the Chief of Staff are going to have to decide. And the decision, as he did mention as well, will be in the late spring or early summer sometime. But to get to those numbers is going to take a lot of complicated decisions, and for us to lay out a process which includes bringing back your comments so they can evaluate all this criteria as we move forward. So we'll talk a little bit about the SPEA. As most of you know, we opened up the SPEA for public comment on 26 June 2014. It closed on the 25th of August 2014, 60 days. We received over 111,000 comments from the 30 installations. That include 21,950 from here. We hear you, Fort Benning. And I think that's important. Now, what we analyzed here at Fort Benning for the overall projections was 10,800. Now, that 10,800 included 9,493 soldiers and another 1,274 civilians. Now, those are not your projected losses or your actual losses. Rather, they're just the cumulative totals for us to take and look at what the worst possible case scenario could be at this installation as it was for the other 29. So of the 30 installations that we analyzed, 26 of them had significant social economic impacts. And they were significant here as well at Fort Benning. About $727 million in sales and about $8 to $9 million in taxes that would be lost from sales as well. So the Secretary and the Chief of Staff, and of course my boss, General Cloutier, understand all this. That's why we did the SPEA. The fact that it's roughly double of what we had to do in the PEA of 2013 is why we had to circle back once again. And again, I think by the number of comments that you had, clearly the message got out. And that's important, once again. So what do we do as we move forward from 490? We should know soon enough what the numbers are going to be, but we're looking at probably 450,000 by the end of FY17. And if we have to stay on the course that we're at, we're looking at 420,000 by FY19. So that's another 70,000 soldiers over the next 4 fiscal years. And that's what we're really sort of grappling with in the building as we move forward. And so these anticipated end strength are going to have to come out of actual units that are in existence right now. There's nothing really left for us to harvest that we haven't already been able to take out of the force. So the Army's process, and of course if you look up at the top left, you can see why we're here today, where we are. It's the listening session. And this is the portion where we want to take back your comments. You can see that it's all driven, of course, by the Budget Control Act, defense strategies, the QDR, and all of those other things that feed into what makes up the Department of Defense. And you can see the whole timeline there, and again, as General Cloutier mentioned, we anticipate having these decisions sometimes in late spring or early summer. As I did mention earlier, the Chief of Staff did his press conference on the 25th of June, and he announced going from 570 to 490 with the entire BCT reorganization. So here's what the Army considers. The military value analysis is for the BCT installations only, of which Fort Benning is one of them. So we had a nice discussion before we came in here earlier, and that's where the Center of Army Analysis comes in, and they look at things like railhead, deployability, connectivity, quality of life. All of these things go together, and it gives sort of a rank order of the BCT installations. But on top of that, there are other things that they have to take into consideration. Of course, strategic concerns are a primary factor, readiness impact if we move units around, and I'll just highlight one more, which is, of course, the listening sessions, and that's why we're here today. So that's it for the slides that we have. I always, whenever I stand up in front of a large audience, large or small, distinguished or not so much distinguished. I always say thank you. Thank you for your service, for those that are serving in uniform. Thank you for assisting our soldiers and their families, for those of you that support them. And thank you for the support that you do for your communities, and we look forward to your input.